Hey everyone, Joey here. So, as you may know, I'm into tweaking, troubleshooting, helping people with mainly fixes for their gaming PCs when you're having some kind of issue. And I also, do a lot of tweaking and my own overclocking for decades now. So, all the way back to Athlon 64, I used to overclock and just tweak my systems for the most optimal temperatures and performance, but not from an overclocking world record benchmark perspective. From a casual user, I want my system to run cool and last as long as possible perspective, whether I plan on selling it or plan on keeping it. I just do that for all my systems. So, I'm on a 5600X now, but I've got a 6700K in the lounge my kids are using, and that's running at 4.5 gigahertz all core, which is conservative. You can push it up to 4. I've seen it as high as 4.8 on some setups with custom water cooling, but it's running an air cooler. So, 4.5 gigahertz, and it's still solid from the day that I set up the overclocking and stress tested it. And I only used a very light method, which I've shared multiple times on my channel, which is maybe an hour worth of stress testing at most, but it works for casual use. The main thing, an hour worth of stress testing on the CPU, but the main thing is you need to spend a long time making sure your RAM is stable. That is the critical part. If you don't do thorough memory testing, you could have the most stable CPU overclock and you'll get a random, crash a month later or something like that. So anyway, what I wanted to talk about today was clock stretching and the latest Agesa 1.2.0.6c. There is 1.2.07 that has just released on some X570 boards, I think with ASUS and MSI. But the main issue is a lot of people are saying there's issues. The Agesa itself is stable, but they have adjusted the behavior, especially with PBO disabled. They've capped the voltage. So if you run full stock, not this one. This is a bug in the MSI BIOS. If you run full stock, so this one here, hopefully you can see these images properly because I am running on 1080p and it's stretched, so it looks a bit funny for me. But this is stock with PBO disabled. The max V-core under load was 1.2 volts, and as you can see, the single core CV is not too bad. This is about normal, really. But look at the effective clocks. It was peaking around 4.4 gigahertz. And this effective clocks is also how you detect clock stretching when you have a new CPU, and especially a new Ryzen CPU, I should say, because the clock you normally see in like hardware monitor or your OSD, you've got like a monitoring tool. You could have anything. Like we'll look at hardware monitor. If you just look at hardware monitor, it does not have an effective clock reading. It has a instantaneous or discrete clock reading. And what that means is it's just showing you the last reported clock from the discrete clock metric, which is basically only including certain states. Like, as you can see here, you can see the 3.6 gigahertz, not parked, but 3.6 is just before the cores park themselves. Okay? And then 4.65 is the reported clock under load. But it's not including any of the nanosecond sleep states in between. And that is, so you can't tell if your system's clock stretching at all. And the way you detect clock stretching is using either hardware info, because they have added that. They've added a clock stretching metric. So if I open my hardware info now, you'll see it. If I got that open. And you can see here, like, just ignore these names where I put core clock 1 to 4. This is for integration with MSI Afterburner. So if I run a game or something, I can actually show you the effective clocks integrated into MSI Afterburner if I want to do a benchmark or something. But this is just core, which one is it? Core 0, thread 0. So if you know how the layout is, as you can see here, there's 2 threads for every core. And yeah, but basically you can see here, if I stretch this out, this is the actual estimated, I should say, frequencies that the cores are running at in an almost idle state. So I'm recording with ReLive, that's GPU encoding, and as you can see, they're going well under 3.6. If you're not using the right tool, the last reported clock is all you're going to see. And under load, all you're going to see is the max reported clock, which is not accurate. So clock stretching is when you'll have a max reported clock, but your actual performance is a few hundred megahertz under your max reported clock. So clock stretching is like this. This is clock stretching at stock settings on a 5600X. So if you're running a 5600X stock and you're seeing 4.65 gigahertz and you think that's the performance you're getting, your scores are not 4.65 gigahertz scores. You're going to be getting 4,300, 4,400. That is actually low for 4.65 gigahertz. If you run without clock stretching and you tune it, so your effective clocks are up at 4649, as you can see on this picture where I've adjusted my PBO limits. I had to enable PBO to unlock the limits because otherwise you stay on stock limits. So if you're not sure how it all works, for the Ryzen CPUs, they have default limits, which is to do with power and temperatures, mainly power. And these limits are in the BIOS under PBO AMD overclocking. So you have to enable Precision Boost Overdrive to actually access them and increase them. But the default limits are down at like 78, 60, 90 for PPT, EDC, and TDC and EDC. And those default limits clock stretch by default. So, you're seeing 4.65 gigahertz. None of the benchmarks, none of the reviews online that are testing PBO disabled showing 4.65 gigahertz boost are actually 4.65 gigahertz boost because their effective clock is 4.4-ish. So as you can see here on this picture I was showing you, the score of 4.65 gigahertz effective is up at 4563 or almost 4600 if you're on Windows 10. I'm on Windows 11, so there is a performance hit. I have to basically disable every single background service and driver and everything just to try to get close to 4600. And my single core scores are down on Windows 11 as of what's the version we're on today? As of 22,652. Earlier releases of Windows 11 had very similar Signbench scores once you tweaked everything. For some reason, now the CB single thread scores are low. It could be Agesa related, but I just couldn't get 600 like a lot of review sites were getting. No matter what I did, like I could uncap the limits. Even a plus 150 on the plus 150. Where did I do it? I tested like a bunch of different limit settings, like changes. Even here, plus 150 megahertz, and this is conservative limit. So as you can see, I was hitting PPT and EDC, but on single thread, they shouldn't be hitting anything. And I was still only getting 592 in best case scenario. Like I couldn't get it up to 600, 591, plus 150. I did do a plus 200 run and it got closer. But yeah, then you're also running plus 200 on the cores. This is with PBO overclocking. So anyway, that's clock stretching. If you want to know about it, the main thing you need to know with clock stretching is to eliminate it. You have to enable PBO and increase your limits along with having good enough cooling to keep the temperatures reasonable. So, under 80C, you can go over 70. 70 is like a good point. If you can keep it under 70, you'll have the best of both worlds, like good temps, good performance. And certain workloads will throttle past 70 degrees, even though the damage or the throttle limit or the T-junction for the CPU is up at 90 plus. I think it's like 90C or 95C is the throttle where it'll actually throttle the CPU clocks. But past 70C on an AVX benchmark can affect your scores. Look, so if I kept my temperature at 65C or 60C and I run Signbench R20, I will get better scores than if it's at 75C. So long story short, there is some frequency temperature scaling. It's very small, but you can't properly see it in a tool because all the tools have I'll just go in here, they have a polling rate. And I set mine higher so that the benchmarks will give me accurate scores. But if I set the polling rate low enough to see the micro, like how quickly the clocks are actually adjusting, it affects the Signbench score. So then I'm not getting an accurate score anyway. But for example, I could set it to 100 ms. And I'll just give you an example of how quickly these clocks change. That's how fast they change. It's like it's faster than 1 ns. It's like a nanosecond frequency change. That's how quickly the CPU is actually working. So when you're looking at these big clocks and you've got the default polling rate of 1000, look at how much data you're missing, right? And that applies to Signbench and AVX benchmarks and things like that. So just imagine you're trying to tune something and you think it's nothing to do with the temperatures. Those nanosecond changes to the clock speed are more frequent at a high temperature. it will throttle more at a nanosecond level, and it's to do with AVX workloads. Most benchmarks aren't affected. Like you're running a gaming benchmark, that's perfectly fine. Don't worry about that. You can run over 70C. It's not going to do anything. But when you're running certain types of benchmarks like Signbench, and you're going over 70C, there is some kind of weird clock stretching, basically, at a really fast scale that you won't catch unless you set your time, your polling rate really high. And I'll give you an example, just because not many people show this on their tech. They're talking about their CPU and clock stretching and such. If I set this polling rate to 100, now my scores aren't going to be accurate because I'm recording. I'm doing too many things in the background, and Signbench is heavily affected by anything you're doing. But if I just run the multi, and we open this, so you see it's running now. Now watch these. See that? And our temperature, if we can see the maximum, is at 68C, or the current. Watch the current. So current, and this is on conservative for 465 with minimal clock stretching. You can see the maximum hit 4649. So that's basically no clock stretching. It's within 1 megahertz of the maximum boost. But look at the current. See how that keeps fluctuating? 4646, 4645 megahertz. Now watch as it pushes into 70. 4643, 4644. It's going down lower, and it's only a small variance, but it was holding 4645, 4646. My fans are going to ramp up, though. They might be able to keep it under control. But as it pushes higher, 4643, you see it peaked at 71? The lowest reading I saw was 4643, but you can't catch it on any other metric. You got to be watching the current column. You won't see it in maximum. You won't see it in minimum. You won't see it in any of the discrete clocks. And yeah, 4176, that's because I'm recording. I'm doing too many things. And the polling rate tanked the frame rate, the score. If I fix the polling rate back to 2000, okay, so it's back at 2000. We'll see if we can get our score to come back up to closer to a normal 4.65 gigahertz number. But as you can see here, you're not going to see how quickly it might be going up, changing. You can't see it anymore. But again, it's a catch-22 because the hardware info metric itself, the polling, affects the score. So you increase that so you can't see the nanosecond or the millisecond changes to the clock speed. But my score is going to go up anyway because I just set it from 100 ms polling rate up to 2000. So my score will improve now, but I can't catch any minuscule changes to do with temperature. But yeah, anyway, to eliminate clock stretching, you have to have hardware info. With PBO enabled, you'll be able to see your PPT, TDC, and EDC percentages. So if you're throttling on one of these, you'll clock stretch. But you can clock stretch and throttle while not clock stretching. So in other words, I'm clock stretching here by maybe 1 megahertz. It's within margin of error. But even though I'm hitting my EDC limit under load, my scores are around about what I should be getting. Like if I uncap this so it stays under 100%, my scores will be roughly the same. I actually hit around 4,500-ish if I'm not, recording at the same time. Recording seems to tank it. You can see the score improved from just changing the polling rate. But just to give you guys that idea, my actual non-clock stretching scores are with a good, I had to tune my limits to what I found gave me the best balance of, because as you can see, some limits, some settings will give you higher temperatures and you get very little score or very little performance boost. Like an extra 50 points in Signbench in real world is nothing. It's nice for the scores. It's a lot for the scores. If you're a Signbencher, 50 points is great. But if you're just trying to get your optimal, I don't want it to clock stretch under max load, you'll find certain PPT limits will just increase your temperature with very little performance boost. So this setting, for example, Agesa 1.2.0.6c, 0 megahertz on PBO, so it's the same default PBO, which is 4.65 gigahertz boost, 110/70/120 on the limits, and 4594 with my score, but my temps were hitting 76 degrees Celsius. So that's a bit on the high side for my purpose, which is gaming. And when I capped it down, 98, 65, 105, 70C, I cut it by 6 degrees, and the maximum voltage dropped by about 0.040 on the core voltage. Now it's already great. Like, it's low voltage anyway, because the new Agesa runs lower voltage curve. So if you didn't know, if you leave your default settings and you don't tweak it, your scores will go down because of the curve, but you can alleviate that by giving it more power. You can uncap the limits and everything like that. You can add plus 100 megahertz. It's a bit weird. They've changed the frequency scaling a little bit too. So at default, you'll actually run lower, especially on single thread. And I don't know if they're going to fix that, but I'm not getting full boost speeds anymore on single threaded workloads. But in reality, there's not a single game I know of that I play, at least, that uses single thread. Always there's like load under four threads or more. And if that's the situation, then all you really need to care about is the all-core boost. So if I just go through here, wait, I'll try to find it. There was one setting that gave me the most optimal. Here we go. So plus 150 megahertz was great. That's 4.8 on the discrete clock, but I was only getting effective around 4688, 4652, as you can see here. And I got 4591, almost 4600 CB, and 591 on an air cooler. So this is the Deepcool AK620. And these are decent scores. Because I have like older scores on Windows 10 even. If I just bring it up. Where is it? I had some testing I did way back. I'm pretty sure I was still on Windows 10 at this point. And this was on like Agesa. Did I list the Agesa? 1.2.0.3. And my sign bench scores were at stock, for 4.6, even on all core, which is the most accurate you can, if you set it in a locked frequency. It was only like 4530 for 4.6 gigahertz and 582 on the single. And then for PBO with like roughly the same curves, nothing was that great to begin with. So there could have been some placebo. A lot of people are saying it's not that good. And then my effectives were always under 44 unless I uncapped them. Just using stock limits. So stock limits was, well, not stock limits, but stock limits that I was using for my CPU. I was trying to use the same limits for all my testing, was 886090. So if you know, and I even listed it here, 886090 on this spreadsheet. And I was just testing a bunch of stuff, just seeing how the CPU behaved, how PBO behaved. And this was Agesa 1.2.0.3. And that's so I could also see what the BIOS was doing. And I could see what I was getting under load. So this is with a heavy negative curve, though. I was using minus 30 curve. That turned out to be unstable. Minus 29 is rock stable for me. I've never had a crash or a Wii error or anything like that under minus 29. Minus 30, I had like a rare crash that would just sometimes randomly happen. And then after tuning my memory, I knew it wasn't the memory. And minus 29 just eliminated any problems. But as you can see, even here, I had plus 75, and I wasn't getting that high on multi. Multi has gone up with Agesa 1.2.0.6c. It could also be tuning I've done and the better cooler. But this was in, I even put the ambient temperatures in here. This was in 28C ambience, and I can get better multi scores in 31C ambience, but then I have been increasing the limits. The plus 20 limits, which I may have tested somewhere. Did I test the limit increase? Here we go, plus 30% limit. So 114, 78, 117. This is like a higher score. 609 on the single, 68C load temp. That was actually pretty good. That was pretty good. But again, that minus 30 made a big difference and it wasn't stable. But 4536, the multi was still down. And this was on Agesa 1.2.0.3, right after the CPPC fixes. And I tested all the CPPC differences, like CPPC on, preferred off, CPPC off, preferred on. There's all combinations you can do, CPPC off fully. And when I tested all that down here, I figured out that CPPC on, preferred off, seemed to have the most consistent performance for both single and multi. So the multi wasn't too bad with, you can have them on, and the power draw is a little bit, where was it? The V core was a little bit different, under 45 times with CPPC on, preferred off. but I just found that this seemed to give the most consistent performance, so that's what I've kept. And I have retested it recently, and it's the same. Like I'm not getting, where is it? I do have one here, CPPC, because all these are CPPC on preferred off, and then I did one with preferred on, and there was no benefit. I actually had an increase in temps. This was the preferred off, preferred on. So just look at the preferred off 1.237 peak voltage, preferred on 1.244 preferred voltage, just from that preferred thing. And also preferred on switches my load threads from core 0 to core 2, which isn't a problem. They're both stable. There's no problem there. It's just the multi-core performance went down and the voltage went up and the temps went up because of that voltage, even if it's only 2 degrees. But and you can see the idles were the same. The minimums 37, 37. The ambient room temp was 31 in both of these. So if you're wondering about my temperatures, if they seem high on an AK620, I'm in 31 degree ambience testing this, and I've got like 2 temperatures in the room, one in front of the monitor and one in front of the tower. They're both showing the same temperature. So it is fairly controlled, and the room doors closed when I test. And if there's a temperature increase, I try to manage it, but it usually stays bang on 31 with my fan speeds and everything. There's enough ventilation from a little window in the corner of the room, and that seems to balance the temperature to stay at 31 degrees. So, yeah, if you're wondering how do I eliminate this clock stretching, we'll get all this Agesa stuff out of the way. Basically, what I've noticed with the Agesa 1.2.0.6c, sorry, I have to go into my PC standard-X clock stretching limits. Like, why did I close that folder? The main difference, if I go through all these, this is on Agesa, I should have listed it somewhere, 1.2.0.3c. I actually went back to 1.2.0.3c to test it. And if we find one with similar limits, 98, 65, 105, okay, I'll use the, I reckon I can get the full names to show up. Maybe? Was I shrinking them? There we go. Okay, now you can see all the naming I've done, and it is kind of all over the place. You have to be very careful what you're reading. But if I just go through here, I will upload these into a folder so you can look through them yourself, because it is basically, anecdotal testing, because I'm not a professional. Like, I don't keep it a super clean OS, but I do run the same apps every single time. And when I run my Signbench, I always close Afterburner and exit lag. I only leave the Adrenaline software and hardware info open. And I do that for consistency because I still want to see what the CPU is doing, even if it hurts the scores slightly. And I just set the polling rate to 2000. So if you want to replicate my testing, you can use hardware info, but set the polling rate up to 2000 just to avoid it interfering too much. And if we look here, so Agesa 1.2.0.3c, 98, 65, 105. We'll open that one. These are very conservative limits, so they were throttling. But you can see here the peak voltage was 1.231, and the score we got was 4520, 571. Okay, so we'll put this here on the left. Makes sense. And then we go to 1.2.0.6c, and I should have a test 98, 65, 105 at the same settings without any added frequency. So the same minus 29 curve. This is it. So 1.2.0.6c. Same curve, and we'll expand these first and have a quick look at the scores. I did not do the single because it was always the same, like between both Agesas. 4520 on 1.2.0.3c, 98, 65, 105, 4549 on 1.2.0.6c. So Agesa wise, we haven't lost any multi-performance. We've gained a little bit. And I always wait as well. After rebooting the system with new settings, I wait for all the background stuff to finish. I sit at idle for quite a while, and then I run the test more than once just to make sure that the score's not changing. And usually they're bang on. Like, even though Signbench can be heavily affected by background processes, if nothing is running, you'll get the same score almost every time, maybe within 1 point. So I'm sure people that run Signbench do know this, but it's based on your background apps and whatever. Maybe if I was running a more minimal OS, like Windows 10, I would be getting better scores. But the main thing I was interested in is this screen. So ignoring the clock stretching and the scores, like, actually, it would have been nice if I kept Clockstretching open, but I was mainly focusing on the voltages. This is interesting. The temperatures were only 1C higher, okay? But the core voltage, the max core voltage, 1.225 on Agesa 1.2.0.6c versus 1.296. That is considerable. That's a considerable difference. Actually, we should be looking here. This is on the motherboard voltage reading, 1.231, sorry. So it's only like 10 higher. That explains the minor voltage difference. But the scores went up. So yeah. But anyway, if you're interested in this kind of thing, I guess it's data you can look at. And I kind of went overboard. I didn't have to test this much. I could have just done like 3 tests on the different Agesa versions, and that would have been enough. But I also wanted to try to eliminate. I was playing with clock stretching at the same time, and I even rolled back because of it. So this one was plus 50 megahertz, 110, 70, 120 on Agesa 1.2.0.3c. So this is more when I uncap limits. Actually, that's where I saw the bigger difference. If I can just close some windows here. So plus 50 megahertz, 1.2.0.3c, 110, 70, 120, and that scored 4630, which is a really good multi score. And then on 1.2.0.6c, I did do plus 50 megahertz, 110, 70, 120. So this is where we get some more interesting data. 4612, slightly lower, same single. So yeah, as you can see, that's what I meant. Why I didn't always run the single. It was exactly the same on my system. And here we see the clock stretching and everything. We got slightly higher on the effective clocks because plus 50 is 4.7 gigahertz maximum. But you can see the voltage is just slightly higher. So 1.288, 1.3 on the older Agesa. And our VRM MOS went slightly higher from that as well. Oh, no. It's slightly higher because I was testing for longer. So this is actually where the longer testing was affecting system temperatures, not ambient room temp. My ambient room temp was the same. I was always checking it. But as you can see, we were a few degrees. The VRM was warmed up, to say the least, because I had been running a ton of testing prior. And I think with the AK620, I'm getting more ambient heat off the CPU cooler hitting the chipset somehow. I'm not sure this is just anecdotal, but on the Gamax 400 Pro, which was on the left, you can see temperatures were actually very close. Like, it's almost disappointing because the limitation here is not the cooler's capacity, how big it is, but how quickly heat can transfer from the die to the plate. That was the limit. So if you just think about a cooler in total, the cooler heats up and reaches a thermal capacity, and the fans and its ability to dissipate that heat will dictate your maximum temperature. But then before that, or after that, I should say, the amount of heat that can transfer from the CPU's die itself to the cold plate of the cooler will be your limit. And both coolers could dissipate heat quick enough to keep up with the transfer. So their capacity was about 76 degrees. Like what they can absorb wasn't reached. So even on the Gamax 400 Pro, which is a slim tower cooler similar to a Noctua U12S, they were both able to dissipate this level of voltages, this amount of heat at the same rate. But because the transfer of the plate only lets them dissipate heat at that specific rate, they capped out at 76C both under a multi-core load. Like under a short-term multi-core load, we might see maybe a longer heat load. We might see the AK620 pull ahead, but just keep in mind that they're doing this in 31C ambience. And if I was in 21C ambience, both of these would be for 4.7 gigahertz. Both of these would be literally 10 degrees cooler. So 66C, that's pretty damn good. But what's surprising though is the Gamax 400 Pro on the left would have been 10, it would have also been running 10 degrees cooler, and it would have kept up with the AK620 on this CPU. If I was on a stronger CPU that had higher, like more heat coming through from the CPU die to the plate, although that might have still been a limiting factor, there'd be a point where you overload the cooler's capacity to dissipate heat. And although they do both have two fans, the AK620 has the two heat sinks split up, and overall more heat sink surface area. So I would assume the AK620 would pull ahead, but it's a weird area because I did the pasting and everything. Like, it's a good mount. There's nothing wrong with the cooler mount. If I'm gaming, I'm getting slightly lower gaming temperatures actually, because it is keeping up with the transfer rate of the plate to the CPU, the cooler plate. So both the contact areas are keeping up at a gaming load, and I saw slightly lower gaming temps, but it's within a few degrees, like around the 50C mark. So they're both very low. And if I was in 10 degrees cooler ambience, my gaming temps would be 42 degrees, like so low. But anyway, just so you can see the Agesa thing here, because I've seen a lot of posts about it, and if you were curious how it's behaving, this is the behavioral difference. You mainly just want to look at these V cores. And the slightly higher voltage means slightly higher effective frequency by 10 megahertz, and that is why there's a direct correlation with that 10 megahertz into 4630 versus 4612. But you got to keep in mind that 10 megahertz may not seem like a much, but depending on how fast it is, how fast those clock speeds are holding. So this might be holding 4695 and just bouncing between 4695 and 4694 at this voltage. This could be going 4683, 4680. I don't know what it was doing because I can't accurately measure that while keeping consistent scores. So I can't set the polling rate low enough to see it, but I know that it's doing it. And yeah, we can also see the minimum 0.881, 0.869 on the minimum voltage for sleep state, basically. But that's not how low it goes. That is also a discrete reading. If you actually open Ryzen Master, you'll see proper readings for your sleep voltages. This is also educational for anyone that didn't know about the effective clocks and clock stretching. So just take a look at this. It's also where you can check your limits if you didn't know, like if you set them in the BIOS or if you've just got yours on default and you want to check them without going into the BIOS. Open Ryzen Master, it has PPT limit, and if it's got nothing here, it means that you've got no limits. You've got it all disabled somehow. Probably there was a way that I could get some of the limits to disappear completely, even at stock settings. There was a setting that affected those limits. I think EDC I could get rid of. I can't remember the exact BIOS setting, but there's one that affects it, and it just removes the ADC limit altogether. It could be a BIOS bug. But basically, under Ryzen Master, you can see your actual cores asleep. And this is where effective clocks come from. They're giving you an average of the load frequency, including the sleep state. So even though your last reported clock was, say, 3720, or 3.6 right before the cores sleep. Once the cores sleep, they're at 0 megahertz effectively, and they're also waking up at a nanosecond level. Like even Ryzen Master is not polling it purposely doesn't poll the CPU because polling it wakes it up. So it's not polling any of these cores. The only thing waking them up every 2000 milliseconds is hardware info. So it's actually bad to run hardware info 24/7 if you're actually causing your CPU to sleep less. But as you can see here with the 2000, we can actually see they're sleeping with 2000 ms on hardware info. And if I close hardware info, you'll actually see the core sleeping for longer without getting woken up constantly, especially on these last three cores. And the actual average core voltages are well below 0.8. They go all the way down, 0.32 volts at idle. And the peak voltages, since I've opened Ryzen Master anyway. So yeah, I hope this kind of makes sense. I know it's hectic, like it's all over the place the way I explain it, but I'm trying to cover a lot of information in kind of one video. I should make a targeted video on clock stretching and maybe a targeted video on eliminating it, or clock stretching as a one topic. But I just wanted to show you. I also wanted to discuss the Agesa stuff. So yeah, use Ryzen Master if you want to see your actual. And this applies to all core as well. If you set an all core 4.6 gigahertz overclock, you do not eliminate sleep. It still sleeps. So you could be at 4.6 at a fixed voltage, and people are saying it's bad. You're not actually at a fixed voltage when you run an all core overclock. So contrary to popular belief, even the Ryzen AMD people that are supposed to know the best, they actually do admit it somewhere. There is a paper where one of them does admit it, or an interview. He says that you still have sleep state as a fallback for idle voltages. So if you're running 4.6, 4.8 gigahertz all-core, you will have higher core current at idle slightly if you use hardware info to check. But then if you check in Ryzen Master, you'll see half your cores are just like this. You'll see a bunch of them asleep, and you'll see a very low average core voltage because they're sleeping. So even an all-core is fine if you're using the right tools to measure it. But if you're just using what everyone else uses or following, this is not a stab at anyone, but even the people on Reddit that say that all-core is bad, it's not as good as PBO. I feel PBO is more optimized, but there is a limit because when you set all-core, you'll also get more consistent single core performance, because I've noticed between the Agesas, the single core can go up and down because it doesn't hold its clock speed. An all-core overclock will hold its clock speed under load multi and under single because all the cores boost more efficiently. Not more efficiently, I should say, more accurately. They will hold their clock speed as if you've got the scaler set up to level 10 or something, to level 1, I should say. No, level 10. Level 10 is the higher one. So anyway, enough of that. I might dabble in some all-core, but again, with the all-core overclocking, you also have less core. No, you have the same amount of core parking. So it might be worth it, like, because my CPU can do 4.7, 4.8 at around that voltage, you still get sleep states, even though it won't report it. The discrete clock will actually look higher, but you still get sleep states. So it might be worthwhile just to see if the scores are more consistent. But again, for gaming, it's not a big deal. And I just wanted to share some of the testing. So this is minimal clock stretching, and if I wasn't running hardware info, the score can jump up. It's like 4580, and I was getting around 570 single, and this is from Windows 11. I am being very, very tempted to go back to Windows 10, but in the context of workloads, check all my gaming benchmarks. You'll see the CPU's usage on more than one thread is always 4 threads plus. So in that context, if I go back to Windows 10 just to get my single threaded score up, then I'm going to have trouble of when direct storage launches properly. Like I think Forspoken is one of the direct storage titles. When that launches with native support on Windows 11, I am hoping that Windows 11 has that advantage because it's got native direct storage API support. Direct storage should theoretically work better on Windows 11, even though Windows 11 has its own bloat. It's got L3 Windows 11 uses L3 cache in some kind of detrimental way to performance and bandwidth testing compared to Windows 10. And if you run them side by side, Windows 11 has 1ns higher L3 cache latency after they fixed it, and it's got variable bandwidth, as in the OS is somehow hitting the L3 cache even during a test, and you disable, security, disable Windows Defender and all scanning and stuff, you'll still get weird L3 cache bandwidth, and it's been reproduced. A lot of people can verify that. But mainly that's the thing I'm concerned about. It's like Windows 11 is detrimental, but then supposedly it'll be good. Or it can somehow it helps with gaming performance for some people, and they say that their Windows 11 gaming performance is better. That could be placebo. But the main deciding factor on whether Windows 11 will take off or be worth sticking with is Forspoken's release and direct storage benchmarks against Windows 10, because Windows 10 is getting direct storage. It's just not native built into the storage stack support. So I'm not sure if that even matters that much, because Windows 10 is more efficient in terms of L3 usage. It doesn't annoy the L3 cache. I don't know what it does, how it runs it, but it seems to be better to me overall. That and Windows 11 just sucks because they tried to this BS right here with the notification tray is still in the latest build of Windows 11. Taskbar corner overflow. Why is that a better name than notification tray? Like, who in their right mind renamed something simple, notification tray, to taskbar corner overflow? They turned it from 2 words into 3 words, and they think that that's streamlined. And then there's no master switch show all icons on or off. There's none. You have to individually enable every single icon. And if you simply want to rearrange your icons like that, stuff starts disappearing even though you've set it to show itself. So yeah, I just lost 2 icons, and I have to. And look, it didn't even register. It's still buggy. See that? 2 icons are hidden now, and I have to find whichever ones they are. So it was Afterburner, and I have to turn them on and off to get them to show again. And I don't know, this just annoys me. It's a backward step. Like, they built the OS. How do they leave a bug like that? And why would they remove a feature, which is the show all icons button? Because I don't want to freaking click for every single freaking notification tray icon that I could possibly run, including Steam and all this. I don't want to individually have to turn them on and off. And if I reinstall any of these apps, they'll disappear again, and I have to go back in here and enable them. And it might not seem like much, but when you're using a computer, 365 days of the year, and you're uninstalling apps and reinstalling them, it's just that extra little tedious step that's annoying. And it's worth talking about because they haven't fixed it all the way up to the latest build, the latest consumer build. So Windows 10 Home Pro, Windows 11 Home Pro, I should say, Home Edition. They haven't fixed it and given us a master switch. So there's reduced functionality in the notification tray on Windows 11 versus Windows 10, which had a simple switch. You could still do the individual stuff, but they had a simple switch to show all your icons by default. So yeah. Anyway, guys, now that that's out of the way, all my benchmarks have minimal clock stretching now. In the future, I was running at basically stock limits in prior benchmarks. So if you saw 4.65 gigahertz, it could have been 4.4 for some of my old ones. It does not really affect gaming, though, in the sense that at 3440 by 1440, I was mostly GPU bound regardless. It helps with the 1% lows a tiny bit, but for the most part, gaming doesn't actually use 100% or anywhere even close to that of the CPU. It's not the same as a benchmark. So minimal clock stretching in a benchmark does not mean anything in terms of a gaming scenario. Because gaming doesn't take your CPU to 100%. I'll give you an example. I'll show you what the actual clocks look like in a benchmark under effective clocks. And this is why it didn't matter. I was going to make a video and say all my benchmarks are invalid, but it's not actually true. Clock stretching is nice to eliminate under a 100% load in Signbench, but in a gaming load, it is meaningless in terms of you need to tweak your stock settings 5600X and eliminate clock stretching. Does it matter? So, for example, I could be clock stretching here, right? You're seeing 4650. Even if whether you're clock stretching or not, if you're running stock settings and it's a GPU workload, if I uncap the FPS, as long as your GPU can hit a high utilization, you're not CPU bound. So at my resolution of testing, it's not CPU bound. But here is what the effective clocks actually look like under gaming, and it's nowhere close to your max load clocks down here at the bottom. That's what the actual effective clocks are, including sleep states. Half the cores are asleep, and most of them, their effective clock, including the parking that they're doing and the waking up, and how I said that they do it on a nanosecond level. Most of that is this is the current reading here. That is actually what you're getting, and that is how it was whether I increase the PPT limits, if I eliminate the clock stretching and make sure they have enough power so that they're not hitting any of the EDCs, which are here. They will never be hitting PPT, TDC, and EDC under the majority of gaming loads, even if you're running stock default, PBO disabled, PBO enabled, whatever. They're never going to be hitting it because the cores are never at 100%. So that's what you need to just understand, is that even if someone said, I had clock stretching inside Benchmark 20, I fixed it, my 1% lows may have improved, at the end of the day, the CPU never hits 100%, so we're never CPU bound in the sense where clock stretching would actually matter. So we're never hitting 4640 as an effective clock because the cores are actually parking so often. And if I set this rate, that's what the cores are doing. So yeah, you can just see that it doesn't matter. It's not going to matter for a gaming workload, and that's what the majority, even CPU heavy titles Hunt Showdown, I tried just checking, and it's basically the same. More threads are active because it's a more multi-threaded game, but the effective clocks were all well under 4 gigahertz for it to even matter. It doesn't matter if I clock stretch under Signbench. So it's just nice that I've eliminated it. It may improve 1% lows. It may be a placebo, but it's good to know about. It's good to be aware of. But in reality, I would even be happy to run full stock settings, just default limits, which is 78, 60, 90. And just don't worry about clock stretching. But, if you like to tweak your system and get the most performance, and as you can see, my temperatures are 50C. On the AK620, if I was running this benchmark, and I had an air-conned room, this is with the benchmark actually running, I would be literally on 38C, 39C. If my ambient in the room right now is 32C. So yeah, just sharing. Oops, I messed up my recording somehow. Yeah, I hit the wrong keys. I'll just quickly show as well how the AK620 looks in a Rakk Haliya case. So you can see that here. I do not have a fan in the frontmost area because it's pointless. If you put a fan there and you've got a case that's got front intake, what's going to happen is the front intake is going to come in and go up out the fan as an exhaust. And if you have it on intake, it's a dust trap. So you don't want to be pulling in dust from the top of the case without a good filter. And, it's kind of just detrimental altogether. And I need a flashlight. Do I have one lying around? I do. Let me pull a flashlight so you guys can see. I've got a dark room. There's windows open behind me. They're frosted windows. So if I turn the flashlight on, this is the AK620. There's the clearance on a Rakk Haliya. Okay. And look at the RAM. That is some T-Force Dark ZA. If anyone knows, it's fairly tall RAM. Not as tall as some of the Corsair RAM you could get, but fairly tall. And the clearance, it just clears it. Like, there's like a millimeter of space. But you can see that it's flush with the top of the cooler. And the fans are really good. They're really quiet. I can set them at max RPM, and I can barely hear it over the PC cooler Halo RGB fans I was running on my Gamax. But yeah, very happy with the cooler overall. Just the aesthetic, the design is great. I highly recommend this cooler for anyone looking for a D15 alternative. And yeah, I'm just happy with it. The price is so good. So, what was I talking about here? Nothing. Just showing these are Arctic F12s on the front. That's a Fantex 140mm at the top. I can't remember. They kept changing their fan names. So it's a Fantex 140mm. I don't know. I'm probably going to change it to a P12 at some point. Or a P14, I should say, Arctic. Just because I prefer the Arctic fans for their versatility and their pricing. It's just the best balance of both. And an Arctic F12 at the back. But you can see my system temps when I run benchmarks is pretty darn good for 31 degrees ambient. And oh no, I don't have my other temperature sensor going. But anyway, thanks for watching, guys. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe. If you want some details on any specific area, I will go into detail on a targeted video soon, specifically for clock stretching, because I was kind of all over the place talking about Agesa on this one, and I've got them. I was kind of like jumping back and forth between both. So I will do a new video talking about both of them and just fill you guys in on that. So yeah, see ya. Have a good one.